So, brethren, welcome to Shabbat services, and it's good to be back. We've been away for a few weeks, but now we are back in preparing for the spring holy days. And so I thought it would be appropriate, given the fact that we haven't done this study for over a year, and that we have some different understanding from what is typically taught in Christian and Jewish assemblies, that we should review the requirements for the Last Supper and the Passover and see what the scripture actually tells us, and see if we can correct some of the errors that we have been exposed to through the various assemblies that we fellowshipped with. We came into the understanding through an organization which was an offshoot of the Worldwide Church of God, and they had a particular way of observing the Lord's Supper and the Passover. And then they had an event called the Night to be Much Observed, and they never really could truly explain what that night was. So by studying the scriptures and by comparing the Old and New Testament, we think that we have an accurate understanding of the requirements for this celebration. And so we'll review that today, and we'll look at how we will be observing the spring high days in just a couple of weeks' time. So please start by turning to the book of Leviticus. And we will go to Leviticus chapter 23 and start in verse 1. Leviticus 23, starting in verse 1. And Yahweh spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the children of Israel, and say to them, The feasts of Yahweh, which you shall proclaim to be set-apart convocations, these are my feasts. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is the Sabbath of solemn rest, a set-apart convocation. You shall do no work on it. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. These are the feasts of Yahweh, set-apart convocations, which you shall proclaim at their appointed times. On the 14th day of the first month at twilight is Yahweh's Passover, and on the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to Yahweh. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it, but you shall offer an offering made by fire to Yahweh for 7 days. The seventh day shall be a set-apart convocation. You shall do no customary work on it. So obviously Leviticus chapter 23 is where we find all of the requirements for the timing of the feast days. But there's a couple of things here that we need to look at, because some confusion starts right from this very beginning. In verse 5 it says, On the 14th day of the first month at even is Yahweh's Passover. And that word, which is translated in the King James Version as at even, is the Hebrew word, it's Strong's word, H6153, and it's areb. And that word is translated typically as dusk, or the day or evening tide. And confusion comes in between the various sects of Judaism. It comes in the Church of God, it comes into the Messianic and the Apostolic communities as to about what that word at even actually means. And so this word twilight, some people interpret it to be the evening portion immediately after sunset. So the Karaite and the Samaritans regard this as being evening, so the word Areb they understand to be the period immediately after sunset, whereas the Rabbinic and the Pharisees take the meaning to be in the afternoon, between the two evenings, so sometime between noon and sunset, what the Hebrew would be Bar Ha-Erabim. So we have some confusion. So what we need to do is to study the scripture and see if we can identify what actually is meant by this word Erev, or evening, or twilight, because that affects the whole timing of the spring high days and the celebrations that we'll be observing. So let's turn in our exploration to the book of Exodus, and let's look at the instructions given specifically for the Passover period, so that we can try and discern which is the correct interpretation of that word Erev. So Exodus chapter 12, and we will start in verse 1. Now Yahweh spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th of this month, every man shall take for himself a lamb according to his house. According to the house of his father, a lamb for a household. And if the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbour next to his house take it according to the number of the persons. According to each man's need, you shall make your count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or from the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it at twilight. And they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts, and on the lintel of the house where they eat it. Then they shall eat the flesh on that night, roasted in fire. With unleavened bread and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled at all with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with a belt on your waist, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. You shall eat it in haste. It is Jehovah's Passover. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am Jehovah. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague will not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to Jehovah throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an everlasting ordinance. 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall remove leaven from your houses. For whoever eats leavened bread from the first day until the 7th day, that person shall be cut off from Israel. On the first day there shall be a set-apart convocation, and on the 7th day there shall be a set-apart convocation for you. No manner of work shall be done on them, but that which every one must eat, that only may be prepared by you. So you shall observe the feast of unleavened bread. For the same day I will have brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. Therefore you shall observe this day throughout your generations as an everlasting ordinance. In the 1st month, on the 14th day of the month, at evening, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month at evening. For 7 days no leaven shall be found in your houses, since whoever eats what is leavened, that same person shall be cut off from the congregation of Israel, whether he is a stranger or a native in the land. You shall eat nothing leavened in all your dwellings. You shall eat unleavened bread. So let's look at some of the key verses, some of the key thoughts that we take from that scripture. In verse 3 it says, speaking to the congregation of Israel, in the 10th day of this month they shall take to them every man a lamb. So the actual observation of the feast days starts on the 10th day of the month by choosing the lamb, selecting the lamb. And then in verse 6 it tells us, and you shall keep it unto the 14th day of the same month, and the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel shall kill it in the evening. And there again we see that word arev, which is the word of confusion that we're trying to address. But they keep the lamb from the 10th day until the 14th day at evening. And in verse 11 it says, you shall eat it with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is Jehovah's Passover. So there is a sense of urgency about this ceremony. There is a sense of urgency with this meal. And we'll see that gives us some good information later on into how we put together this sequence of events. And then in verse 14 it says, and this day shall be to you a memorial. You shall keep it as a feast to Jehovah throughout your generations. You shall keep it as a feast by an ordinance forever. And this is where the Worldwide Church of God and the various Church of God offshoots came up with this concept of this night to be much observed. It was an ordinance forever. So there is a lot of scriptures here, and we need to piece these scriptures together to come up with the correct understanding of this period. So let's just bear these scriptures in mind, and then we'll look at a couple more. In verse 15 it says, 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. And one of the mistakes we made when we first came into the faith was we felt very proud of ourselves that we had unleavened our homes, that we had no leavened bread. And then it was only at the end of the feast that we realized we had not fulfilled the requirement of actually actively eating unleavened bread. We'd unleavened the homes, but we were not actively participating in the sacrament of the unleavened bread. And it says, whoever eats leavened bread from the first to the seventh day shall be cut off from Israel. So there is a requirement on his people not to eat leavened bread and to cleanse ourselves. And in fact, there are dietary requirements. There are many dietary expectations now that recommend if you can go for a week without eating yeast products, it improves your health. So Yehovah here is already giving us health advice in his word, in his scriptures. And in verse 17 it says, in the self-same day have I brought your armies out of the land of Egypt. So again, this is a useful piece of information later on. The first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread is the day he brings his people out of Egypt. And then it says in verse 18, on the 14th day of the month ye shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day. So we have a 7-day period of eating unleavened bread that starts on the 14th day. And again, that gives us some information about how this sequence of events actually ties together. But let's continue in that chapter, and we'll come to the end of the chapter and get the rest of the information that Yehovah provides us. So starting again in verse 21. Then Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out and take lambs for yourselves according to your families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take a bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, and strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood that is in the basin. And none of you shall go out of the door of your house until morning. For Yehovah will pass through and strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the 2 doorposts, Yehovah will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your house to strike you. And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which Yehovah will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, what do you mean by this service? That you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice of Yehovah, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households. So the people bowed their heads and worshipped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so, just as Yehovah had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did. And it came to pass at midnight that Yehovah struck the firstborn of the land of Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sat on his throne, to the firstborn of the captive who was in the dungeon, and all the firstborn of the livestock. So Pharaoh rose in the night, he and all his servants, and all the Egyptians, and there was a great cry in Egypt, for there was not a house where there was not one dead. Then he called for Moses and Aaron by night, and said, rise, go out from among my people, both you and the children of Israel, and go, serve Yehovah as you have said. Also take your flocks and your herds as you have said, and be gone, and bless me also. And the Egyptians urged the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, we shall all be dead. So the people took their dough before it was leavened, having their kneading bowls bound up in their clothes on their shoulders. Now the children of Israel had done according to the word of Moses, and they asked from the Egyptians articles of silver, articles of gold, and clothing. And Yehovah had given the people favour in the sight of the Egyptians, so that they granted them what they requested. Thus they plundered the Egyptians. Then the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot besides children. A mixed multitude went up with them also, and flocks and herds, a great deal of livestock. And they baked unleavened cakes of the dough which they had brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were driven out of Egypt, and could not wait, nor had they prepared provisions for themselves. Now the sojourn of the children of Israel who lived in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of 430 years, on that very same day, it came to pass that all the armies of Yehovah went out from the land of Egypt. It is a night of solemn observance to Yehovah, for bringing them out of the land of Egypt. This is the night of Yehovah, a solemn observance for all the children of Israel throughout their generations. So again, there are some good verses in there which help us put this sequence together. Verse 29 says, "And it came to pass that at midnight Jehovah smote all the firstborn of the land of Egypt." And in verse 33, "And the Egyptians were urgent upon the people that they might send them out of the land in haste, for they said, We be all dead men." So we see there's this urgency from midnight to the next morning. There's this urgency for the Israelites to leave. In verse 39, "They baked unleavened cakes of the dough which was brought out of Egypt, for it was not leavened, because they were thrust out of Egypt, and could not tarry, neither had they prepared for themselves any victuals." And in verse 42, "It is a night to be much observed unto Jehovah." So here we see this sense of urgency. So from the Passover angel going over Egypt to leaving Egypt, there was this real urgency for the people to come out and the people to move into their wilderness journey. And there's one more piece of information that's given to us in the book of Numbers. So if we turn forward just a few pages to Numbers chapter 33, and we will start in verse 1. Numbers 33, starting in verse 1. "These are the journeys of the children of Israel, who went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now Moses wrote down the starting points of their journey at the command of Jehovah. And these are their journeys according to their starting points. They departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the month, on the day after the Passover. The children of Israel went out in boldness in the sight of all the Egyptians. For the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn whom Jehovah had killed among them. Also on their gods Jehovah had executed judgment." So again, a critical piece of information for us in verse 3. "And they departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the month, on the morrow after the Passover." So the morning after they celebrated the Passover, the children of Israel left Egypt for their wilderness journey, and this was the 15th day of the first month. So we now have a number of pieces of information. How can we put this together? Well, given the fact we have two potential options, one of them is that the word Erev means the period immediately after sunset, and the other one is that Erev means the period before sunset. So let's look at the first option. The Erev would put the Passover early on the 14th day. So if we follow that sequence from the Old Testament, on the 10th day the lamb is selected. Shortly after sunset, on the 14th day, the lamb is killed, it's prepared, it's roasted, and then it has to be eaten by midnight. And then there's a period from midnight on the 14th until the morning on the 15th where the people of Israel are just basically standing around waiting. And then it says on the morrow of the 15th day, the morning of the 15th day, they leave Egypt in haste. The other option is that the word Erev actually means the later portion on the 14th day, so the afternoon portion just before sunset. Again, on the 10th day of the month, the lamb is selected. This time in the afternoon period of the 14th day, the lamb is killed. It would then be prepared and roasted, and then before midnight, so this is now after sunset, so this is the evening portion of the 15th day, they eat the Passover lamb before midnight, and then in the morning portion of the 15th day, they leave Egypt in haste. So those are the two options we have from the scriptures in the Old Testament. And just one thing I wanted to look at, I was doing some research. This time of year, when we celebrate Passover in Jerusalem, sunset will be at 5 minutes past 7. Here in Yardley, it will be about 7:30. Now, if you think about how long, if you've ever roasted a whole lamb or a goat, how long it takes to roast an animal, it would take about an hour to prepare the animal. They have to bleed the animal. They're not allowed to eat the meat with the blood in it, so it has to be bled. They would then have to skin the animal, because obviously they wouldn't roast it with its skin. They would then need anywhere between 3 and 6 hours to roast the animal, then to serve it, and then to eat it. So it would be a real rush to have this animal killed, prepared, roasted and eaten if you don't start till after sunset on the 14th day. Whereas you do have enough time if you start mid-afternoon. If you started, say, around about 3 o'clock on the 14th day, you could kill the animal, you could bleed it, you could prepare it, you could roast it for 4, 5 or 6 hours. The animal will be ready to eat about 10 o'clock at night, and you could have the meal finished before midnight. So those are just a couple of data points that we need to hold in mind as we continue in this exploration. But the Old Testament gives us two options, and we can argue backwards and forwards. We don't have absolute proof based on what we see in the Old Testament. So, does the New Testament give us anything to help us with this exploration? Let's turn to the Gospel of John, and let's look at some of the New Testament statements and see if the example of Yehoshua can give us any more understanding about this sequence for Passover. So we'll start with John chapter 12, and we will start in verse 1. John 12, starting in verse 1. Then 6 days before the Passover, Yehoshua came to Bethany, where Lazarus, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Yehoshua, and wiped his feet with her hair, and the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, who would betray him, said, "Why was this fragrant oil not sold for 300 denarii and given to the poor?" This he said not because he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief, and had the money box, and he used to take what was put in it. But Yehoshua said, "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you will have with you always, but me you will not have always." Now a great many of the Jews knew that he was there, and they came, not for Yehoshua's sake only, but that they might also see Lazarus, whom he had raised from the dead. But the chief priests plotted to put Lazarus to death also, because on account of him many of the Jews went away and believed in Yehoshua. The next day a great multitude that had come to the feast, when they heard that Yehoshua was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees and went out to meet him and cried out, "Hosanna! Blessed is he who comes in the name of Jehovah, the King of Israel." Then Yehoshua, when he had found a young donkey, sat on it, as it is written, "Fear not, daughter of Zion, behold your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt." So here we see the beginning of the New Testament narrative, and we are given some useful information here. In verse 1 it says, "Then Yehoshua 6 days before the Passover came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, where he'd been dead, whom he raised from the dead." And in verse 12 we're told, "On the next day much people that were come to the feast, when they heard Yehoshua was coming to Jerusalem, took branches of palm trees." So they selected him, they declared him the King of the Jews. So again, we have two options. If it's if it's late on the 14th, we take off 6 days. That means he was in Bethany on the 8th day, which means he would have entered Jerusalem on the 9th day. If, however, the sacrifice is made late on the 14th, that means the Passover is on the 15th day. 6 days before that would put Yehoshua in Bethany on the 9th day. The day after, Yehoshua would have been entering into Jerusalem on the 10th day. So that's a piece of information that's useful for us. Let's now look at the Gospel of Luke and gather some more facts that we can bring to this study. Luke 22, and we'll start in verse 1. Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes sought how they might kill him, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered Judas, surnamed Iscariot, who was numbered among the 12. So he went his way and conferred with the chief priests and the captains, how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he promised and sought opportunity to betray him to them, in the absence of the multitude. Then came the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. And he sent Peter and John, saying, "Go and prepare the Passover for us, that we may eat." So they said to him, Where do you want us to prepare? And he said to them, Behold, when you have entered the city, a man will meet you carrying a pitcher of water. Follow him into the house which he enters. Then you shall say to the master of the house, The teacher says to you, Where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? Then he will show you a large furnished room. There make ready. So they went and found it just as he had said to them, and they prepared the Passover. When the hour had come, he sat down, and the 12 apostles with him. Then he said to them, With fervent desire I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of the Mighty One. And he took bread, gave thanks and broke it, and gave it to them, saying, This is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Likewise, he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is shed for you. But behold, the hand of my betrayer is with me on the table. And truly the Son of Man goes as it has been determined. But woe to that man by whom he is betrayed. Then he began to question among themselves which of them it was who would do this thing. So I just want to point out, in my Bible there, verses 17 and 18 are omitted because they are not in the Aramaic Peshitta. So that's a mistranslation that was copied into the more modern scriptures. So if you missed a couple of verses there, 17 and 18 are not in the Aramaic scriptures. But looking at the information we're given, now the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh, which is called Passover. And in verse 7, the day of unleavened bread, when the Passover must be killed. Now, from what we've seen in the Old Testament, these are false statements. The Feast of Unleavened Bread is the 15th day of the month. The Passover is killed on the 14th day of the month. So either the scriptures are in error, which poses as a problem because it says all scripture is profitable for doctrine, or there is another explanation as to why this terminology has been used here. So we need to be careful about how this terminology is used. What's happening here is we're seeing the vernacular. So in the Jewish faith, they talk about the Passover as that entire 7-day period. It's the spring festival, and they call it Passover. Now, when I was in the Navy, we used to have fixed leave periods. So we would have a Christmas leave period, and that could be the 2 weeks up to Christmas or the 2 weeks after Christmas, depending on which duty you were in. But we called it Christmas, so I could actually celebrate Christmas leave in the new year, depending on which duty cycle you were in. But we called it Christmas leave. So I think what you're seeing here is the vernacular. They're calling this period the Passover, but it's not strictly true. People use Luke 22 to say Yehoshua celebrated the Passover with his disciples, but that would then make the scriptures contradict each other. So we have to be careful how we apply and understand these scriptures. So let's go back to the Gospel of John, and let us see if we can gather more specific evidence about how this is put together. So let's go to John 18, and we'll start in verse 28. Then they led Yehoshua from Caiaphas to the praetorium, and it was early morning. But they themselves did not go into the praetorium, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. Pilate went out to them and said, What accusation do you bring against this man? They answered and said to him, If he were not an evildoer, we would not have delivered him up to you. Then Pilate said to them, You take him and judge him according to your law. Therefore the Jews said to him, It is not lawful for us to put anyone to death. Thus the saying of Yehoshua might be fulfilled, which he spoke, signifying by what death he would die. Then Pilate entered the praetorium again, called Yehoshua, and said to him, Are you the king of the Jews? Yehoshua answered him, Are you speaking for yourself about this, or did others tell you this concerning me? Pilate answered, Am I a Jew? Your own nation and the chief priests have delivered you to me. What have you done? Yehoshua answered, My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would fight, so that I should not be delivered to the Jews. But now my kingdom is not from here. Pilate therefore said to him, Are you a king then? Yehoshua answered, You say rightly that I am a king. For this cause I was born, and for this cause I have come into the world, that I should bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth hears my voice. Pilate said to him, What is truth? And when he had said this, he went out again to the Jews and said to them, I find no fault in him at all. But you have a custom that I should release someone to you at the Passover. Do you therefore want me to release to you the King of the Jews? Then they all cried again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. So here we see a very useful piece of information which many people overlook. But in verse 28 it says this, They led Yehoshua from Caiaphas unto the hall of judgment, and it was early, and they themselves went not into the judgment hall, lest they should be defiled, but that they might eat the Passover. So the Jews refused to go into the Roman garrison, into the Roman court, because under the Jewish tradition, if they entered a Gentile facility, they would be unclean for the day. And if they were unclean, they would not be allowed to eat the Passover. So the Jews had not yet eaten the Passover meal. But if people would take Luke 22 at face value, they said, well, Yehoshua ate the Passover the night before he was executed. But here, Yehoshua is obviously still alive because he's going into Caiaphas for judgment. So there seems to be a contradiction. Did Yehoshua eat the Passover? Did Yehoshua and the Jews have two different Passover events? Or is there a misunderstanding in how we're interpreting Scripture? There is one other point, it's a side issue, but in verse 40 it says, Now they called again, saying, Not this man, but Barabbas. Now Barabbas was a robber. And this just shows how much satanic deception was happening at this time. If we understand the Hebrew, Abba means father, so Abbas means of the father, and Bar means son, so Barabbas means the son of the father, who was a robber. And we know that Satan himself was a thief and a deceiver from the beginning. So we see here that even in this text, when we understand the Hebrew, the children or the Jews chose a false son of the father, this Barabbas, who was basically the stool pigeon of Satan, who was put in the place of Yehoshua, and they chose this false son of the father in place of Yehoshua, the true son of Yehovah. That was just a side issue, but it was worth mentioning. So let's turn over just one page to the next chapter of John, John chapter 19, and we'll start reading from verse 14. John 19, starting in verse 14. Now it was the preparation day of the Passover, and about the 6th hour, and he said to the Jews, Behold your king. But they cried out, away with him, crucify him. Pilate said to them, Shall I crucify your king? The chief priests answered, We have no king but Caesar. Then he delivered him to be crucified. So they took Yehoshua and led him away. And he, bearing his stake, went out to the place called the place of the skull, which in Hebrew is Golgotha. There they crucified him, and two others with him, one on either side, and Yehoshua in the centre. Now Pilate wrote a title and put it on the stake, and the writing was, Yehoshua of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Then many of the Jews read the title, for the place where Yehoshua was crucified was near the city, and it was written in Hebrew, Greek, and Latin. Therefore the chief priests of the Jews said to Pilate, Do not write the King of the Jews. But he said, I am the King of the Jews. Pilate answered, What I have written, I have written. Then the soldiers who they had crucified Yehoshua took his garments and made 4 parts, to each soldier a part, and also the tunic. Now the tunic was without seam, woven from top in one piece. They said therefore among themselves, Let us not tear it, but cast lots for it, whose it shall be, that the scripture might be fulfilled, which says, They divided my garments among them, and for my clothing they cast lots. Therefore the soldiers did these things. Now there stood by the stake of Yehoshua his mother and his mother's sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Yehoshua therefore saw his mother and the disciple whom he loved standing by, he said to his mother, Woman, behold your son. Then he said to the disciple, Behold your mother. And from that hour the disciple took her to his own home. After this, Jehoshua, knowing that things were now accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, said, I thirst. Now a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled a sponge with sour wine, put it on hyssop, and put it to his mouth. So when Jehoshua had received the sour wine, he said, It is finished. And bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. Therefore, because it was the preparation day, that the bodies should not remain on the stake on the Sabbath, for that Sabbath was a high day, the Jews asked Pilate that their legs might be broken, that they might be taken away. Then the soldiers came and broke the legs of the first and of the other who was crucified with him. But when they came to Jehoshua and saw that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. But one of the soldiers pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water came out. And he who has seen has testified, and his testimony is true, and he knows that he is telling the truth, so that you may believe. For these things were done that the scripture should be fulfilled. Not one of his bones shall be broken. And again another scripture says, They will look on him whom they pierced. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, being a disciple of Jehoshua, but secretly for fear of the Jews, asked Pilate that he might take away the body of Jehoshua. And Pilate gave him permission, so he came and took the body of Jehoshua. And Nicodemus, who at first came to Jehoshua by night, also came, bringing a mixture of myrrh and aloes and about 100 pounds. They took the body of Jehoshua, bound it in strips of linen with the spices, as was the custom of the Jews is to bury. Now in the place where he was crucified there was a garden, and in the garden a new tomb, in which no one had yet been laid. So there they laid Jehoshua, because the Jews' preparation day, for the tomb was nearby. So there's a lot of information in that scripture. So let's start in verse 14. It says, And it was the preparation of the Passover, and about the 6th hour he said to the Jews, Behold your king. So here we see this is the preparation day. We know that the weekly Sabbath, the day before the Sabbath, is the preparation day. The day before the high day is the preparation. So we know that by Jewish understanding, the Passover had not happened. It was still the preparation time. And we know that the 6th hour is noon. The day started round about 6 in the morning at sunrise, and the 6th hour would be noontime. So here, Jehoshua was still alive at noon on the day before the Passover. In verse 31 it says, The Jews therefore, because it was the preparation, that the bodies should not remain upon the stake on the Sabbath day, for that Sabbath day was a high day. Here we're told two things. It was the day before the Sabbath, so it's the preparation day, and the Sabbath was a high day. And this helps us discern the difference between a Friday execution, the Good Friday, which is the traditional Christian teaching, and the actual day on which he was executed. But it was the day before the Sabbath, and the Sabbath was a high day. So it's referring to the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And in verse 42 it says again, There they laid Jehoshua, because of the Jews' preparation day, for the sepulchre was nigh at hand. So there was a rush to get Jehoshua off the stake, get him into the grave, because it was coming up to sunset, which would take them into the Passover and the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So again, we see all of these things coming together. Now, for many people, they've missed over this, and they've not understood the detail that's provided us with the scripture. So let's just look for another witness. We always try and find at least two witnesses. So let's turn back just a few pages to the Gospel of Mark, and let's look at some parallel passages. So in this case, Mark chapter 15, and we'll start in verse 33. Now when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And in the 9th hour Jehoshua cried out with a loud voice, saying, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, which is translated, my mighty one, why have you spared me? Some of those who stood by, when they heard that, said, Look, he is calling for Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge full of sour wine, put it on a reel, and offered it to him to drink, saying, Let him alone, let him see if Elijah will come down and take him down. And Jehoshua cried out with a loud voice, and breathed his last. Then the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. So when the centurion who stood opposite him saw that, he cried out like this and breathed his last. He said, "Truly, this man was the Son of the Mighty One." There were also women looking on him from afar, among whom were Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joseph, and Salome, who also followed him and ministered to him when he was in Galilee, and many other women who came up with him to Jerusalem. Now when evening had come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent council member, who was himself waiting for the kingdom of the Mighty One, coming and taking courage, went in to Pilate and asked for the body of Yehoshua. Pilate marvelled that he was already dead, and summoned the centurion. He asked him if he had been dead for some time. So when he found out from the centurion, he granted the body to Joseph. Then he brought fine linen down, took him down and wrapped him in the linen, and he laid him in a tomb which had been hewn out of the rock, and rolled a stone against the door of the tomb. And Mary Magdalene, the mother of Joseph, observed where he was laid. So again in the Gospel of Mark we see this same information. When the 6th hour was come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. The 6th hour is 12 noon. It went dark, it stayed dark for 3 hours, and in the 9th hour, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Yehoshua died. And in verse 42 it says, "And when even was come, because it was the preparation day, that is the day before the Sabbath." So we're clearly told in the Gospel of Mark, Yehoshua died on the preparation day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And that is an absolute statement from the Scripture. So let's look at putting the New Testament information together. Again, looking at the two alternatives. If the Passover is sacrificed early on the 14th day, i.e. immediately after sunset, we would end up with this sequence. On the 8th day of the first month, Yehoshua would be in Bethany. On the 9th day, Yehoshua would enter Jerusalem. Then on the evening portion of the 14th day, he would celebrate the Lord's Supper and Passover with his disciples, if we take Luke 22 at face value. Then on the daylight portion of the 14th day, it is the day of preparation when Yehoshua died. Then nothing happens that evening, and then we go into the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But see, we have a problem here. The preparation of the Passover is actually happening after Yehoshua is supposedly has taken the Passover. Whereas if we see the event happening late on the 14th day, Yehoshua would be in Bethany on the 9th, he would have entered Jerusalem on the 10th, he would then have had the Last Supper with his disciples, then that night he was betrayed, he was taken into the praetorium, the Jews would not enter because the Passover had not yet happened, he died on the preparation day, he was taken off the stake, the Jews then celebrated the Passover, and the very next day, in that evening period, and the next day was the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So again, we have two options in the New Testament narrative. So now let's bring the New Testament and the Old Testament together with a couple of other scriptures to bring us to that understanding. So let's look at a scripture now which really helps us tie this together. John chapter 1, starting in verse 29. The next day John saw Yehoshua coming toward him and said, "Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One, who takes away the sin of the world. This is he of whom I said, After me comes a man who is preferred before me, for he was before me. I did not know him, but he would be revealed to Israel. Therefore I came baptizing with water. And John bore witness, saying, I saw the Spirit descending from heaven like a dove, and he remained upon him. I did not know him, but he sent me to baptize with water, said to me, Upon whom you see the Spirit descending and remaining, on him this is he who baptizes with a set-apart Spirit. And I have seen and testified that this is the Son of the Mighty One. Again the next day John stood with his two disciples, and looking at Yehoshua as he walked, he said, Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One. The two disciples heard him speak and followed Yehoshua. Yehoshua turned, and seeing them following, said to them, What do you seek? They said to him, Rabbi, which is to say, when translated, Teacher, Where are you staying?" He said to them, "Come and see." They came and saw where he was staying, and remained with him that day. Now it was about the 10th hour. And one of the two heard John speak and followed him was Andrew, Simon Peter's brother. And he found his own brother Simon and said to him, "We have found the Messiah," which is translated the Christ. And he brought him to Yehoshua. And when Yehoshua looked at him, he said, "You are Simon, the son of Jonah. You shall be called Cephas," which is translated a stone. So here we see a very important piece of information in the first chapter of the Gospel of John. The next day John seeth Yehoshua coming unto him, and saith, "Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One, which takes away the sin of the world." We know in the atoning sacrifice the sins of Israel were taken away by the atonement sacrifice. We know in the story of Abraham, when he was told to sacrifice Isaac, that he said, "Jehovah will provide for himself a lamb." And here we see that prophecy being fulfilled. Yehoshua is declared as the lamb whom Jehovah has provided. And there's one other scripture which really ties this up for us. Let's turn to the first letter to the Corinthians. 1 Corinthians chapter 5, and we'll start in verse 1. It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and such sexual immorality has not been named among the Gentiles, that a man has his father's wife. And you are puffed up and have not rather mourned, that he who has done this deed might be taken away from among you. For indeed, as absent in body but present in spirit, have already judged as though I were present, him who has so done this deed. In the name of our Master Yehoshua Messiah, when you are gathered together, along with my spirit, with the power of our Master Yehoshua Messiah, deliver such a one to Satan for the destruction of the flesh, that his spirit may be saved in the day of the Master Yehoshua. Your glorying is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump? Therefore purge out the old leaven, that you may be a new lump, since you truly are unleavened. For indeed, Messiah, our Passover, was sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast, not with old leaven, nor with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. So in verse 7 it tells us this: Messiah, our Passover, is sacrificed for us. So in the first chapter of John it says, "Behold, the Lamb of the Mighty One." And in Corinthians it says, "Messiah, our Passover, was sacrificed." So Messiah fulfills the Passover requirement. He was that sacrificial offering. And with that piece of information, we can tie both the Old Testament and the New Testament directly together. So let's look at the two options. If it's an early on the 14th Passover, starting with the New Testament, on the 8th day, Yehoshua was in Bethany. On the 9th day, Yehoshua would enter Jerusalem. According to the Old Testament, on the 10th day, the lamb is selected. And then on the early part of the 14th day, the lamb was killed, eaten, and the Passover had to be eaten before midnight. And based on the New Testament narrative, the Lord's Supper and Passover would have happened at the same time. But then on the daylight portion of the 14th day, Yehoshua was executed. So Yehoshua would actually have died after the Passover meal had been taken. Then there's a period of waiting, and then we have the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So there doesn't seem to be any real coherence. There's no coincidence between the Old Testament and the New Testament narrative. But now let's look at the second option, which is the Passover sacrifice happening late on the 14th day. And the rabbinic tradition is that this happens at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. The Passover lamb is sacrificed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon of the 14th day. So start with the New Testament narrative. On the 9th day of the first month, Yehoshua was in Bethany. On the 10th day of the first month, Yehoshua entered Jerusalem. And that was the time when the Jews said, "Behold our King." It also is on the 10th day under the Old Testament when the lamb was selected by the people. It's the people of Israel who were told to choose for themselves a lamb, which is exactly what happened when Yehoshua entered Jerusalem. Then in the evening portion of the 14th day, we have the Lord's Supper. Then on the daylight portion of the 14th day, which is in fact the preparation day before the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the Passover lamb is killed. And the rabbinic tradition is the Passover lamb is killed at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. Yehoshua was taken into the praetorium. The Jews would not enter in because it was still the day before the Passover, and they would have been made unclean. Yehoshua was nailed to the stake on the 6th hour, which is 12 o'clock, and he died at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the 9th hour, exactly when the Passover lambs would have been killed in the temple. There was then the rush to get him off the stake because the high day was approaching. The Old Testament narrative said that the lamb is prepared, and then after sunset the lamb is eaten, and it has to be eaten before midnight when the Passover angel was passing over Egypt, and that is when in the Jewish tradition they were eating the Passover meal. And then if you remember in the Old Testament they were to eat in haste because the very next morning they were leaving Egypt and the Egyptians were actually rushing them out. And in the New Testament narrative, the next day is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is the day that we remember was the day that the armies of Israel left Egypt. So if we take the Passover sacrifice as happening on the late portion of the 14th day, both the New Testament and the Old Testament narrative come into alignment, they come into focus. So we now have no debate, there's no discussion. We can see very clearly from the information given in the Old Testament and the information given in the New Testament, the actual sequence of events for this period. And that's the sequence that we celebrate in this assembly. We follow the scriptures, and this is what we'll be celebrating in a couple of weeks' time. Now there is another proof that I want to go to, and it will only take a couple of minutes, so we'll quickly go through that. Let's turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. To go forward just a couple of pages into chapter 11, and we'll start reading in verse 17. 1 Corinthians 11, starting in verse 17. Now in giving these instructions I do not praise you, since you come together not for the better but for the worse. For first of all, when you come together as an assembly, I hear that there are divisions among you, and in part I believe it. For there must also be factions among you, that those who are approved may be recognized among you. Therefore when you come together in one place, is it not to eat the Master's Supper? For in eating each one takes his own supper ahead of others, and one is hungry, and another is drunk. What? Do you not have houses to eat and drink in? Or do you despise the assembly of the mighty one, and shame those who have nothing? What shall I say to you? Shall I praise you in this? I do not praise you. For I received from the Master that which I also delivered to you, that the Master Yehoshua, on the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread, and when he had given thanks he broke it and said, Take, eat. This is my body which is broken for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same manner he also took the cup after supper, saying, This cup is the renewed covenant in my blood. This do as oft as you drink it in remembrance of me. For as often as you eat the bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Master's death till he comes. So in verse 20 we're told, when you come together in one place, is it not to eat the Master's Supper? So obviously Paul is referring to the Last Supper, the Master's Supper. And in verse 23 it says this, The Master Yehoshua, the same night in which he was betrayed, took bread. Now from Strong's, that word for bread is G740, which is the Greek word artos. And artos means bread, leavened bread, raised bread, a loaf of bread. Okay. Now some would say, well, how can you have raised leavened bread when we are celebrating Yehoshua's Last Supper? Because the Last Supper was Passover, and Passover had to be eaten with unleavened bread. But the scripture is clear, this meal was eaten with leavened bread. Some people would say, well, the New Testament writers weren't that diligent, they just used bread in a generic form, they didn't differentiate between leavened bread and unleavened bread. Well, is that a true statement? Let's remember what we saw in Luke 22. We read that scripture in Luke, and there's a couple of verses there. The very first statement in Luke said, the feast of unleavened bread drew nigh. And if you look at that word unleavened bread, that's the Greek word G106. And in verse 7 it says, then came the day of unleavened bread. Again, the word that Luke used was G106. G106 is not artos, it's azumos. And azumos is the Greek word for unleavened bread. Okay, so Luke in the beginning of chapter 22 twice uses the word for unleavened bread. Whereas in verse 19 of the same chapter it says, and he took bread, this time G740, and gave thanks and brake it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. That word G740 is artos, leavened bread. So Luke very clearly differentiates between unleavened bread and leavened bread. So when people say, well, they were just referring to it in the generic, is inappropriate, is inaccurate. The scripture writers clearly said that the Last Supper was celebrated with leavened bread. The scriptures are very clear, the Passover must be eaten with unleavened bread. So again, the Lord's Supper and the Passover cannot be the same event by definition. Otherwise, we would be breaking the commands, we'd be breaking the instructions by using leavened bread for the Passover. And the same information can be found in the Gospel of Matthew, the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospel of John. They all use that word artos, leavened bread, for the Last Supper. So let's look at one more scripture just to really close this one down. And this time we'll go to John chapter 6. And verse 30. John 6 and verse 30. Therefore they said to him, what sign will you perform that we may see that you believe? What will we do? Our fathers ate the manna in the desert. As it is written, he shall give them bread from heaven to eat. Then Yehoshua said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread from heaven, but my Father gave you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of the mighty one is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then he said to him, Master, give us this bread always. Yehoshua said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. And I said to you that you have seen me and yet do not believe. And this is that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that all he has given me I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will of him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up on the last day. The Jews then complained about him because he said, I am the bread which comes down from heaven. Now some people would argue that the Last Supper must have been celebrated with unleavened bread because you cannot represent Yehoshua with leavened bread because leaven represents sin. But if we look in verse 35, it says this, Yehoshua said to them, I am the bread of life. The word which was translated there was G740, which is which was artos, leavened bread. So Yehoshua actually describes himself as being leavened bread. Okay? And he said, I am the bread of life. Whereas if you look in the book of Deuteronomy, unleavened bread is called the bread of affliction. Yehoshua describes himself as the bread of life, with leaven, with life in it. Deuteronomy describes matzo, unleavened bread, as the bread of affliction. So again, we see this difference. So when we put all of these things together, we come up with the following sequence, which the scripture absolutely supports and justifies. On the 9th day of the first month, Yehoshua entered into Bethany. On the 10th day of the first month, Yehoshua goes to Jerusalem, where he is chosen by the people of Israel as their king, which fulfills the requirement to choose the lamb on the 10th day of the first month. On the evening portion of the 14th day, we have the Lord's Supper, the Last Supper, and we celebrate that with a meal and the foot washing ceremony. On the daytime portion of the 14th day is the day of preparation, and it's the day where some 2,000 years ago Yehoshua was executed. After sunset of that day we have the Passover celebration, the Passover Seder, and then in the daylight portion of the 15th day we observe the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So that is the sequence that the Scriptures give us. That is what we will be celebrating as an assembly. And this month the new moon is on Sunday, so the first day of the biblical new year, the first day of the first month starts on Sunday, and counting forward, the Last Supper and foot washing ceremony will be on Friday the 11th of April starting at 7:30. The following day we will have our regular Sabbath services. After sunset on that Sabbath we will have the Passover Seder, and then on the Sunday portion we will have services to celebrate the first day of unleavened bread, and then the following Sabbath on the 19th we will have the last day of unleavened bread. The only difference will be in the past we have taken the Lamb Supper for Passover on the Last Supper, and we've had a potluck meal for the Passover Seder. Having done this study, that is obviously incorrect, because the Passover meal is the one that we should eat with lamb, whereas the Scripture gives us no indication as to what meal Yehoshua ate with his disciples for the Last Supper. In fact, it would seem to indicate it was some form of stew, because he dipped the bread into the sop. So this year we will celebrate the Last Supper and foot washing with a potluck meal, and the Passover Seder with the lamb dinner. So that's the celebration, that's the study we've done for this week, and that lays out the events for the next couple of weeks as we prepare for the spring high days.